It was the kind of silence that should not have existed on a battlefield, stretching across endless Russian plains like something watching rather than waiting, as Napoleon's Grand Army pushed forward under a sky so wide it felt almost unreal. And no one in that moment could have imagined that what lay ahead was not a conventional enemy, not a fortified line of soldiers or a rival commander, but something far more indifferent and far more absolute. A force that did not negotiate, did not retreat, and did not care about strategy or reputation. This was the moment history would later point back to and call the beginning of a collapse no one in Europe believed was possible at the time. Because when the Grand Army crossed into Russia in 1812, it was not seen as an invasion of uncertainty, but as a demonstration of control, confidence, and military superiority. With tens of thousands of men, horses, artillery units, and supply columns moving like a living machine across terrain that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. And Napoleon himself believed that the campaign would resolve quickly, that pressure alone would force a political conclusion. Yet beneath that confidence, something was already shifting in ways that could not be measured by scouts or maps. Villages that should have provided support were empty. Roads that should have carried supplies were breaking apart under distance alone. And the deeper the army moved, the more the land itself seemed to resist being understood, as if Russia was not defending a single point, but dissolving the battlefield entirely. What no officer fully grasped in those early weeks was that the true adversary had not yet revealed itself, that beyond the limits of smoke and movement, there existed a seasonal transformation so severe it had reshaped entire campaigns long before Napoleon. A winter system that would arrive not as a sudden storm, but as a slow and total inversion of everything an army depended on. And yet, there were no warnings strong enough, no historical precedent widely respected enough to make the Grand Army hesitate. Even the reports that trickled in from forward units describing temperature drops, strained horses, and exhausted supply lines were interpreted as temporary friction rather than existential danger, because the idea that nature itself could dismantle a modern military force on this scale simply did not fit into the European logic of war at the time. And that misunderstanding would prove to be one of the most decisive blind spots in military history. Somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of reconnaissance, the Russian landscape was beginning its transformation into something unrecognizable. A shift so complete that movement, survival, and communication would all begin to fail under the same invisible pressure. But at the moment of entry, none of this was visible, only hinted at in the edges of reports and the unease of men who could not yet name what they were sensing. And it is here, at the very edge of certainty, that the real story begins. Because what Napoleon believed he was facing was an enemy he could defeat in weeks, while what he had actually entered was a system that would slowly erase every assumption his army depended on. And the truth of that mismatch is something history would take far too long to fully understand. The strength of the Grand Army was not measured only in numbers, but in the certainty that surrounded it, a confidence built through years of European victories, where opposing forces had collapsed under speed, coordination, and pressure. And as it advanced deeper into Russian territory, that confidence remained intact, even as the environment around it began to behave in ways that no longer aligned with the expectations of conventional warfare. Columns of infantry and cavalry continued forward in disciplined formation, artillery units maintained their rhythm of movement, and supply wagons stretched across the landscape like long mechanical veins. Yet the land itself began to distort the effectiveness of that system in subtle but accumulating ways, as distances between supply points grew beyond practical limits, and roads that once appeared serviceable began to degrade under constant use and changing weather conditions. What made this phase of the campaign unique was not a single catastrophic event, but the gradual accumulation of inefficiencies that spread through every level of command, from high strategic planning down to the smallest logistical decisions made in the field. And each day, the margin between control and disorder became thinner, without immediate recognition from those responsible for maintaining it. Reports from forward units described increasing strain on horses that were essential for transportation, as forage became scarce and recovery time between marches shortened, while soldiers themselves began to experience fatigue not from combat, but from the sheer scale of movement required to maintain operational tempo across such vast territory. Yet despite these signs, the overarching belief within the command structure remained unchanged, as previous campaigns had consistently rewarded persistence and adaptation, reinforcing the assumption that any resistance encountered in Russia would eventually conform to the same patterns observed in earlier European theaters. However, the environment into which they had entered did not conform to those expectations, because unlike previous adversaries who operated within defined strategic boundaries, this theater expanded in both space and unpredictability, making traditional planning models increasingly unreliable as reference points for decision-making. Communication between units also began to degrade in ways that were initially attributed to distance alone, but over time, it became clear that coordination delays were compounding beyond normal operational thresholds, causing misunderstandings in timing and positioning that further strained the cohesion of advancing formations. Still, the psychological framework of the army remained anchored in its earlier successes, creating a kind of cognitive inertia that prevented a full reassessment of the situation even as conditions worsened incrementally. Officers at various levels attempted to adapt by adjusting marching schedules, redistributing supplies, and modifying routes, but these measures treated symptoms rather than addressing the underlying scale of the environmental challenge they were facing. The deeper issue was that the campaign had extended beyond the logistical design limits of the force itself, stretching its capacity to sustain momentum across distances that exceeded practical military experience at the time. As weeks passed, the gap between expectation and reality widened, not through sudden collapse, but through continuous friction, each day adding another layer of strain that would have been manageable in isolation, but became increasingly significant in combination. What made this stage of the campaign historically pivotal was that it revealed, without immediate dramatic confrontation, the vulnerability of even the most advanced early 19th century military system when extended beyond the environmental conditions it was designed to operate within. And this realization emerged not as a single moment of clarity, but as a slow and unavoidable progression that would eventually redefine the entire outcome of the advance. As the advance continued deeper into Russian territory, the operational reality of the campaign began to shift in ways that could no longer be explained by simple distance or supply delay, because the environment itself had started to impose conditions that reshaped every assumption the army relied upon. And what had once been a predictable system of coordinated movement now began to fragment under the weight of accumulated strain across multiple interconnected layers of logistics, communication, and endurance. The further the columns moved from established support zones, the more pronounced these disruptions became, as each division found itself increasingly isolated from the structured network that had sustained earlier phases of the campaign. And the once reliable rhythm of resupply and reinforcement began to break into irregular intervals that forced commanders to make decisions with incomplete information. At the same time, the physical condition of the terrain introduced complications that were not fully anticipated in pre-campaign planning, as vast open stretches that appeared navigable on strategic maps did not account for seasonal variation or the gradual degradation caused by sustained military movement, resulting in routes that required constant adjustment and improvisation simply to maintain forward progress. Within the ranks, the effects of these conditions were felt unevenly but consistently, as units that had previously operated with high efficiency began to experience delays in coordination that affected both timing and cohesion, leading to situations where intended synchronized movements became staggered and less effective over time. Officers attempted to compensate by increasing reliance on local resource acquisition and by adjusting marching schedules to preserve manpower. Yet these adaptations only partially mitigated the broader systemic pressure that was building across the entire force structure. What distinguished this phase from earlier military campaigns in Europe was the scale at which minor inefficiencies began to compound, transforming what would normally be manageable operational friction into a persistent structural limitation that influenced every level of decision-making. Despite these emerging challenges, the overall strategic perspective within the command hierarchy remained largely anchored in previous experience, where logistical strain had always been temporary and reversible once key objectives were secured. reinforcing the belief that continued advancement would eventually stabilize the situation. However, the geographic and environmental scope of this theater introduced variables that did not conform to those historical patterns, as the sheer distance between operational nodes created a level of dependency on continuous movement that left little margin for disruption. Even communication systems, which were critical for maintaining coordination across dispersed units, began to experience delays that affected the timing of orders and responses, creating gaps that widened the separation between intent and execution. As a result, commanders at multiple levels found themselves increasingly reliant on estimations rather than precise data, which introduced additional uncertainty into planning cycles that were already operating under significant pressure. The psychological effect of this gradual erosion of certainty was subtle but important, as it reinforced a growing awareness among field personnel that the environment they were operating in was not merely a backdrop to military action, but an active variable shaping outcomes in real time. Yet, even with these accumulating indicators, the conceptual framework guiding the campaign remained unchanged, as the expectation of eventual stabilization through continued progress continued to dominate strategic thinking, setting the stage for a deeper confrontation between operational doctrine and environmental reality that would become increasingly difficult to reconcile as the advance proceeded further into unfamiliar conditions. As the campaign extended further beyond the limits of its original operational expectations, the underlying strain that had been building across logistical, environmental, and organizational dimensions began to manifest in more visible and interconnected ways, creating a situation where multiple independent pressures converged into a single, persistent challenge that affected every level of movement and coordination. The extended supply routes that once functioned as a reliable extension of the Army's operational reach now began to operate at reduced efficiency, not due to a single point of failure, but because of the cumulative distance, terrain variability, and continuous demand placed upon transport systems that were never designed for sustained operation at such scale, resulting in gradual reductions in the consistency of deliveries that affected everything from food distribution to ammunition resupply and equipment maintenance cycles. At the same time, the human element of the campaign began to reflect the growing environmental and logistical strain, as soldiers who had initially maintained structured discipline under marching conditions began to experience increasing levels of fatigue that accumulated over time due to reduced recovery intervals, longer daily movement requirements, and the absence of stable forward infrastructure. This fatigue did not present itself as a single breaking point, but rather as a progressive reduction in overall efficiency, where small delays in movement, communication, and coordination compounded into larger systemic slowdowns that affected entire formations. Commanders at various levels attempted to respond through procedural adjustments, including the redistribution of available resources, modification of march schedules, and prioritization of certain operational routes over others. Yet these measures were constrained by the fundamental limitation that the system itself was operating beyond its designed capacity. Communication networks, which were essential for maintaining coherence across dispersed units, began to experience increasing latency, leading to delays in the transmission of operational updates and creating gaps between intended directives and actual field execution, which in turn required additional improvisation at lower command levels to maintain functional continuity. As these conditions persisted, the campaign began to demonstrate a structural characteristic that distinguished it from earlier European operations, in which logistical strain typically followed predictable cycles of pressure and recovery, whereas here, the strain accumulated continuously without a corresponding stabilization phase. The environmental context also played a critical role in reinforcing these patterns, as the vast geographic scale of the theater introduced spatial challenges that extended beyond simple distance calculation, requiring constant adaptation to shifting terrain conditions and unpredictable changes in mobility efficiency. Within this framework, even minor disruptions began to carry amplified consequences, as the interconnected nature of the logistical system meant that delays in one area produced cascading effects across multiple dependent components. Despite these accumulating indicators, the strategic mindset at higher levels continued to operate within established doctrinal assumptions, which anticipated that sustained forward momentum would eventually restore equilibrium to the system once key operational objectives were achieved. However, the reality emerging in the field suggested a different trajectory, one in which the environment itself functioned as a persistent variable influencing outcomes in real time, gradually reshaping the operational landscape through continuous incremental pressure rather than discrete moments of confrontation. This divergence between expectation and operational reality became increasingly significant as the campaign progressed, not because of a single decisive failure, but because of the steady erosion of the conditions required to maintain coherence across a force of such scale, operating at such distance, setting in motion a broader transformation in the nature of the advance that would become more pronounced as the situation continued to evolve. As the operational strain continued to intensify across the advancing formations, a new phase of the campaign began to emerge, in which the cumulative effects of distance, resource depletion, and coordination delay no longer appeared as separate logistical challenges, but instead merged into a single continuous condition that shaped every aspect of movement and decision-making. Within this environment, the Army's ability to maintain structured forward momentum increasingly depended on improvisation at multiple levels of command, as standardized procedures that had functioned effectively in earlier European campaigns began to lose reliability when applied across the expanded geographic and environmental scale of the Russian theater. Supply lines that once operated with predictable timing now functioned under irregular cycles of delivery, where intervals between replenishment became inconsistent enough to require local adaptation by field units, and this variability introduced a growing dependence on short-term resource management rather than planned long-term distribution. As a result, commanders were forced to prioritize immediate operational survival over sustained strategic efficiency, leading to a gradual restructuring of how resources were allocated across divisions, with certain units receiving preferential access based on proximity or urgency rather than pre-established logistical planning. At the same time, the communication framework that connected dispersed elements of the Army began to experience increasing degradation in clarity and timing, not through total system failure, but through incremental delays that widened the gap between issued orders and their execution in the field, requiring subordinate officers to interpret directives under conditions of incomplete situational awareness. This shift placed additional cognitive and operational pressure on lower command levels, where real-time decision-making became increasingly important in compensating for the reduced reliability of centralized coordination. The environmental conditions further amplified these systemic pressures by introducing variables that were not fully accounted for in pre-campaign expectations, including fluctuating terrain conditions and extended exposure to open movement corridors that increased the difficulty of maintaining consistent marching efficiency over long distances. Within this context, even routine operational tasks such as regrouping, resupply coordination, and unit consolidation began to require additional time and resources, creating a feedback loop in which delays produced further delays across dependent systems. Despite these accumulating constraints, the overall strategic framework guiding the campaign continued to operate under the assumption that sustained forward progression would eventually restore operational balance once critical geographic or political objectives were reached, reinforcing a doctrinal perspective that prioritized momentum over structural reassessment. However, the field conditions increasingly suggested that the system was approaching a threshold beyond which incremental adaptation would no longer be sufficient to maintain coherence, as the interconnected nature of logistics, communication, and mobility meant that disruptions in one area inevitably propagated across the entire operational structure. This created a scenario in which the campaign was no longer defined solely by external opposition or tactical engagement, but by an internal struggle to preserve functional continuity under expanding environmental and systemic pressure, marking a critical transition in which the sustainability of the advance itself became an active point of concern within the broader operational landscape. As the campaign entered a more critical phase, the accumulated operational strain that had been developing across logistics, communication, and mobility began to converge into a single dominant condition that increasingly defined the reality of the advance, where the system supporting the movement of the Grand Army was no longer functioning as a stable framework, but as a constantly adjusting structure under continuous stress. Supply chains that had once been extended with confidence across vast distances now operated with diminishing predictability, as transport capacity became increasingly affected by cumulative delays, environmental resistance, and the growing inefficiency of maintaining synchronized movement across multiple dispersed formations, resulting in a situation where resource availability varied significantly from one unit to another depending on timing, location, and accessibility rather than structured planning. Within this environment, commanders were forced to adapt not through strategic redesign, but through continuous tactical adjustment, prioritizing immediate operational requirements over long-term consistency, which gradually shifted the nature of command decisions toward short-horizon problem-solving rather than coordinated campaign-level planning. At the same time, the communication architecture that supported coordination across the Army experienced progressive degradation in functional reliability, not as a sudden collapse, but as a steady increase in latency and informational distortion, where messages required longer transmission time and often arrived without the full contextual clarity necessary for precise execution, forcing subordinate units to interpret intent under conditions of partial information and increased uncertainty. This created a widening gap between centralized strategic direction and localized operational execution, which in turn placed additional pressure on field commanders to make independent decisions that could compensate for delayed or incomplete instructions. As these patterns persisted, the cumulative effect began to reshape the internal dynamics of the campaign, transforming it from a unified, coordinated advance into a distributed system of semi-independent movements connected by increasingly fragile coordination links. The environmental scale of the theater further intensified these challenges, as the vast spatial dimensions of the operational area introduced natural delays in movement that could not be fully mitigated through organizational adjustment alone, meaning that even optimized logistical routing still encountered unavoidable inefficiencies simply due to distance and terrain variability. Over time, these interacting pressures produced a feedback loop in which delays in one part of the system generated additional strain in other dependent areas, amplifying the overall instability of the operational structure. Despite these accumulating indicators, the overarching strategic framework guiding the campaign continued to rely on assumptions derived from earlier military experiences, where logistical strain and communication delays were typically temporary conditions that resolved once forward progress stabilized supply access, reinforcing a belief that continued movement would eventually restore equilibrium. However, the operational environment in this theater increasingly demonstrated characteristics that diverged from those expectations, as the persistence and compounding nature of systemic strain suggested that the campaign was operating beyond the effective adaptive capacity of its original design. Within this context, the concept of operational control began to shift from a state of coordinated direction to one of managed improvisation, where maintaining basic functional continuity became as important as achieving strategic objectives, marking a subtle but significant transformation in the nature of the advance as it continued deeper into conditions that placed sustained pressure on every structural component of the force. As the operational system continued to deteriorate under sustained environmental and logistical pressure, the nature of movement within the campaign began to fundamentally change, shifting from a structured forward advance into a progressively disorganized withdrawal of capacity across multiple levels of coordination, where the primary objective was no longer expansion, but the preservation of remaining functional integrity within the force. This transition did not occur as a single defined decision, but rather emerged gradually as units operating at extended distances from central support began to experience increasing difficulty maintaining cohesion, with formations becoming more fragmented over time due to the compounding effects of fatigue, resource scarcity, and delayed communication that reduce the effectiveness of synchronized movement. Within this evolving condition, the ability to maintain consistent command authority across dispersed elements weakened further, as field reports became less precise and more delayed, forcing higher-level commanders to rely on partial assessments that no longer reflected real-time operational conditions, thereby increasing the reliance on local interpretation and adaptive decision-making at lower levels of the structure. As this pattern continued, the distinction between organized maneuver and independent movement began to blur, resulting in a system where units increasingly operated in semi-autonomous fashion simply to maintain continuity under unpredictable circumstances. Logistical support, already strained by distance and environmental variability, struggled to re-establish stable distribution cycles, which led to uneven access to essential supplies across different segments of the force, creating disparities that further complicated coordination efforts and reduced the predictability of operational planning. At the same time, the cumulative physical demands placed upon personnel began to significantly affect overall operational efficiency, as sustained exposure to continuous movement requirements without adequate recovery intervals reduced endurance levels and slowed reaction times, further impacting the ability of units to maintain structured timing during coordinated actions. This reduction in synchronization capacity had a cascading effect on broader operational planning, as the original campaign design depended heavily on tightly timed coordination between multiple moving elements, a condition that became increasingly difficult to maintain under the prevailing circumstances. As the situation evolved, the command structure attempted to adapt through incremental adjustments in routing, prioritization of resource allocation, and modification of movement schedules. Yet these measures were constrained by the underlying limitation that the system itself was no longer operating within its original functional parameters. Communication delays continued to widen the gap between intent and execution, creating increasing uncertainty in the field regarding timing, positioning, and operational priorities, which in turn required additional on-the-ground interpretation to maintain functional continuity. Within this context, the campaign began to exhibit characteristics of progressive structural contraction, where the focus shifted away from expansion of control towards stabilization of remaining operational coherence, marking a significant deviation from the initial strategic framework that had guided the advance. Despite these conditions, higher-level strategic expectations continued to assume that restoration of coordination would occur once environmental pressures stabilized. Yet, the ongoing persistence of systemic strain suggested that the operational environment was not returning to previous equilibrium states, but instead continuing to evolve in ways that required continuous adaptation without clear points of recovery. As a result, the overall system entered a phase defined not by decisive outcomes, but by sustained management of diminishing operational capacity, where maintaining continuity became the central challenge, and the original assumptions of linear progression toward resolution increasingly failed to align with the realities emerging across the expanding theater of operations. As the campaign reached a critical stage of sustained operational degradation, the remaining structure of the advancing force began to function under conditions that increasingly diverged from its original design parameters, where the cumulative effects of distance, coordination loss, and environmental resistance had already reshaped the campaign into a state of continuous adaptation rather than controlled execution. Within this context, the system of movement that had once been defined by synchronized planning and hierarchical precision now operated under a persistent state of fragmentation, in which the ability to maintain unified operational direction was significantly reduced across all levels of command, resulting in a growing reliance on localized decision-making as the primary mechanism for maintaining functional continuity. Logistical capacity, already weakened by prolonged strain and uneven distribution cycles, continued to experience instability that prevented the re-establishment of consistent supply rhythms, thereby reinforcing disparities in operational readiness between different segments of the force, and further complicating efforts to restore coherence across dispersed formations. At the same time, communication infrastructure, which had been progressively degraded through cumulative delays and transmission inefficiencies, reached a point where the reliability of centralized coordination could no longer be assumed as consistent, requiring field units to operate with increasing independence in interpreting strategic intent based on incomplete or delayed information. This shift in operational dynamics resulted in a structural transformation in which the campaign no longer functioned as a unified advancing entity, but rather as a collection of interdependent groups attempting to sustain movement under shared but uneven constraints, where the synchronization of action became increasingly difficult to achieve in real time. As these conditions persisted, the distinction between planned maneuver and reactive adaptation continued to erode, with operational decisions becoming more heavily influenced by immediate environmental and logistical realities than by pre-established strategic objectives. The cumulative effect of these changes introduced a persistent level of uncertainty into the execution of the campaign, as timing, coordination, and resource availability could no longer be reliably predicted across the full extent of the operational theater. Despite ongoing attempts at procedural adjustment, including modifications to movement pacing, resource prioritization, and command delegation structures, these measures were increasingly constrained by the underlying limitation that the system itself was operating beyond its sustainable equilibrium, where each corrective action addressed only localized symptoms without resolving the broader systemic imbalance. Within this environment, the concept of forward momentum began to lose its traditional meaning, as continued movement no longer implied strategic advantage, but instead reflected the necessity of maintaining structural coherence under continuous pressure. As the operational situation evolved further, the accumulation of these interrelated factors produced a state in which the campaign was defined less by its original objectives and more by its capacity to persist despite progressively diminishing functional stability, marking a significant transition in which endurance replaced expansion as the primary measure of operational reality. As the operational reality of the campaign reached its final and most unstable phase, the remaining structure of the advancing force had already transitioned beyond the point of coherent strategic control, operating instead as a dispersed system of units bound together only by residual coordination mechanisms that were no longer sufficient to restore full systemic integrity. At this stage, the concept of a unified campaign had effectively dissolved into a continuous sequence of localized actions, each shaped more by immediate environmental constraints and resource availability than by any overarching strategic framework. And the cumulative result of this transformation was a condition in which the original objectives of the advance had become increasingly disconnected from the actual lived reality of the forces still in motion. Communication channels, already weakened by progressive delays and fragmentation in transmission, had reached a level of inconsistency where the reliability of centralized directives could no longer be assumed, forcing operational decisions to be made through interpretation of incomplete or outdated information, thereby increasing variability in execution across different segments of the force. Logistical systems, under sustained pressure from distance, depletion, and uneven distribution patterns, were no longer capable of maintaining synchronized support cycles, resulting in a persistent imbalance in operational readiness that further widened the gap between units operating under similar strategic conditions but experiencing vastly different material realities. Within this environment, movement itself ceased to function as a reliable indicator of progress, as forward motion no longer corresponded to strategic advancement, but instead reflected the necessity of maintaining structural continuity under conditions of diminishing systemic stability. What emerged was a state of operational inertia, where the force continued to function not because of cohesive direction, but because of fragmented persistence distributed across multiple levels of command and execution. As this condition deepened, the distinction between organized campaign structure and adaptive survival behavior became increasingly indistinct, with each unit effectively operating within a constrained local reality shaped by immediate environmental pressures and the availability of remaining resources. Despite the absence of a singular defining moment of collapse, the overall system had already undergone a fundamental transformation in which its original design purpose had been replaced by the ongoing management of degradation, where maintaining minimal operational coherence became the dominant objective. In this final phase, the campaign existed less as a directed historical event and more as an extended process of systemic exhaustion, raising a lingering question that remains difficult to resolve even in retrospective analysis. At what exact point does a structured advance cease to be a campaign and become instead a prolonged disappearance of control, where the appearance of movement conceals the absence of true direction, leaving behind only the residual trace of an army still walking forward without the conditions that once defined its purpose?